Well, good evening and thank you to everyone, and especially our honoured guests and their families who are participating on the panel, as well as the lawmakers and community leaders, for taking the time to join our conversation tonight. I am the British Consul General, Jeremy Pilmore-Bedford, here in Atlanta, and I'm pleased to see a full auditorium tonight because it is only together that we can put an end to sexual violence in conflict. The use of sexual violence in conflict is one of the greatest injustices of our lifetime. It is hard to document, let alone investigate. Perpetrators do not discriminate because it's not about sex, but violence, terror, power, and control. When rape is committed during conflict, it has often been seen as an inevitable part of war, and so it has been allowed to go unpunished. But sexual violence exists outside of conflict too. The appalling truth is that when sexual violence is committed in a non-conflict and post-conflict situation, it is all too frequently remains unpunished as well. The situations that surround sexual violence exist in all societies, and conflict situations only amplify the problem. Tonight, our panelists will be sharing their views on how we can take together action to end sexual violence in all situations, because the common denominators between sexual violence in any situation is the true problem we must fix. Please help show your support by using our hashtag #TimeToAct, as you post and tweet about the event tonight and about other similar events that you may go to. Now it is my great honour to introduce Emma Wade, the British Embassy's Foreign and Security Policy Counsellor, who will delve deeper into the United Kingdom's goals for our global summit in London and this event in Atlanta, which is part of the global relay, with British embassies and posts around the world hosting different events for 84-hour period across the globe. Emma has spent the last 17 years in the UK's Foreign Service, working on issues from the international trade policy to leading the government's preparations and response to international crises. For her work on the latter issue, she was awarded the Order of the British Empire by the Queen in 2012. As a career diplomat, she has been stationed in Mexico City, Chile, and with the European Commission in Brussels, and also to the UK's mission to the United Nations in New York. In her current role at the British Embassy in Washington, she leads on a wide range of foreign policy issues, including our initiative to end sexual violence and conflict. So please help me and give a warm welcome to Emma Wade.
Thank you, Jeremy, for that introduction, and good evening to you all. It's both a pleasure and an honour to be back here at the Carter Centre. I first came down here last year and was so impressed with the work that's done here, as I've expressed to a number of people here already this evening. And thank you very much to the Carter Centre for hosting our discussions this evening. And thank you to all of you for coming tonight and braving the rain and the traffic. It's through your presence that you are demonstrating your commitment to end sexual violence in war zones, in post-conflict societies, and in our own communities. And it's humbling to share the stage with such an impressive panel. I'm very passionate about this issue, as you're about to find out, and I have been known to speak at great length about it, but I will try to keep my remarks reasonably short tonight, because, like me, I imagine what you really want to do is hear from our panellists this evening. So Jeremy and I, as representatives of the British government, are here this evening because our government is committed to end the use of rape and sexual violence in conflicts around the world. This year marks 2 decades since the Rwandan genocide, where as many as 500,000 women may have been raped in just 100 days. And today, reports of rape and sexual violence continue to be a persistent feature of the civil war in Syria, the conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and many other war-ravaged countries around the world. Through the leadership of my boss, the British Foreign Secretary William Hague, the British government has been leading international efforts to shine a spotlight on this issue and to lend our voice, our resources, and our energy to the efforts of so many unsung heroes all over the world who work on these issues every day, often in very dangerous situations. We want to help drag this issue out of the darkness, which has allowed the world for too long to ignore the scale, the horror, and the damage that these crimes have inflicted in our lifetimes on hundreds of thousands of people, men, women, and children, across every continent of our planet and in every major conflict. The silence that has surrounded this issue has enabled too many of us to convince ourselves that sexual violence is a cultural phenomenon, an inevitable consequence of war. It's not. We believe that sexual violence is a deliberate tool of war, and as such, it can be deterred, prevented, and punished. This silence has enabled a culture of impunity to exist. It cannot be acceptable that in Bosnia, more than 20 years after the end of the war there, we've seen only 30 convictions for sexual violence, where more than 50,000 women and girls and unknown numbers of men and boys were raped during 4 years of conflict in the heart of Europe. We say no more to a world where the vast majority of victims go without justice for the crimes committed against them. The shroud of silence around sexual violence in conflict has repeatedly placed the shame of these crimes onto the victims. Many survivors of both sexes are consigned to a lifetime of isolation, exclusion, and fear. Well beyond the mental suffering and physical scars, sexual violence has a corrosive effect that lasts a lifetime, and often beyond, haunting future generations, the children born of rape, or the families of survivors. We must act to shift the shame firmly onto those who commit these appalling atrocities. Sexual violence blights the individual lives of the many thousands of its victims. It also drives hundreds of thousands more of people from their homes, fueling refugee crises, contributing to further instability and perpetuating conflict. So ending sexual violence in conflict should be at the heart of how we pursue peace, security, and sustainable development, as well as individual rights. Sexual violence is often one of the first things that happens as conflict or instability take hold. Yet it's usually the last thing to be taken into account by those ending wars or rebuilding nations. Appalling acts of sexual violence are happening around the world every day, including right now as we sit here in this room. We say no more. It's time to act. So I'm proud to represent a government that has been working to build an irreversible momentum to end sexual violence in conflict, to offer better support to survivors and end impunity for the perpetrators. I want to take a few minutes of your time this evening to tell you a little bit about what we've been doing in pursuit of this goal. Our work has focused on a high-level and global political campaign, supported, importantly, by a range of practical measures. Because words alone are not enough to end one of the great injustices of our lifetime. To put it frankly, the political track gets you some of the way, and then you need to show you can get stuff done. The UK's political campaign ramped up in April of last year when we secured a historic declaration of the G8 foreign ministers on preventing sexual violence in conflict. This identified rape and sexual violence in conflict as war crimes, constituting grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. A pretty good start, we thought. But not content with this, we chaired a debate in the UN Security Council in June last year, and that resulted in the adoption of a UN Security Council resolution on sexual violence in conflict, the first of its kind in 3 years. But that wasn't enough either. We wanted to secure a truly global commitment to end these abhorrent crimes. So at the UN General Assembly in September last year, we tabled a declaration of commitment to end sexual violence in conflict. More than 4/5 of the world's nations have now endorsed this document, in record time, I'm told, which declares these appalling acts to be war crimes and calls for coordinated international action to hold perpetrators of these crimes to account. Nigeria's recent signature is especially poignant in light of the abduction of more than 200 girls by Boko Haram in the north of that country. I mentioned that we've been taking practical action too to complement this political track. One of the actions we've taken is to create a team of experts. This is a multidisciplinary group of experts in criminal investigation, in law, in forensic science and so on, who are being deployed around the world to support local efforts to document crimes and build evidence for future prosecutions. And these expert teams have already been to countries such as Bosnia, Libya, Democratic Republic of Congo, Mali, and the borders of Syria. We're working with practitioners on the ground to ensure survivors have the support and care they need. And we've been working closely with the Office of the UN Secretary-General Special Representative for these issues, Zainab Bangura, to provide funding and technical expertise for her office to ensure that international efforts are well coordinated. We've also been working with dozens of organisations to produce and field test an international protocol which draws together in one place our knowledge about international standards and good practices around spotting, documenting and evidencing sexual violence in conflict situations. Perhaps the most visible demonstration of our practical effort is the summit that is taking place in London this week. The British Foreign Secretary, William Hague, and the UN Special Envoy, Angelina Jolie, are together welcoming representatives from more than 100 countries, government ministers, survivors, faith leaders, academics, politicians, experts, senior military and police figures, NGOs, all of whom are gathered to find ways to make good on the promises that 151 governments have made in the UN Declaration on Ending Sexual Violence. We're delighted that Secretary Kerry will head up the sizable and senior US delegation, and he'll help close out the summit on Friday, a reflection of the US government's strong commitment and their partnership with the UK in tackling gender-based violence around the world. This summit promises to be like no other, and it will certainly be the biggest meeting ever held on this subject. We want this summit to be the moment the world wakes up and agrees that we must end sexual violence in conflict. We want people young and old across the world to condemn the horrors of wartime, war zone sexual violence, to see the cycles of conflict it creates, and to grasp the role that each of us have, that we can play in ending this crime. Achieving change in the world today requires a fusing of the work of governments with civil society, alongside the power of public opinion. And our hashtag campaign, #TimeToAct, is part of that response. And any of you who are on Twitter this evening may have seen some of the photos, some of well-known celebrities, such as Daniel Craig, will.i.am, and for the older ones amongst us, Rod Stewart. To help spread the word about the scale and impact of these appalling crimes, more than 140 public and free events will take place around the formal summit meetings. So these events will explore sexual violence through such things as screenings of films, theatre and dance performances, photographic exhibitions, and panel discussions. It even includes a hackathon, and others may know what that is better than I do. But I'm told that it brings together programmers to devise apps which will support the aims of this summit. As well, these side events provide an opportunity to discuss some of the broader issues around sexual violence in conflict, including conflict prevention, women's rights and participation, and business and human rights. But above all, we're looking for this summit to produce practical, specific actions to shatter the culture of impunity, to better support and protect survivors, to improve international cooperation, and to put women's voices at the heart of all future efforts to promote peace and stability. So, for example, we want the summit attendees to sign a statement of action that commits to concrete action to help remove wartime rape and sexual violence from the world's arsenal of cruelty, and that pays tribute to the people who have worked tirelessly to bring this issue to our attention for many years. And I'm delighted to say that Secretary Kerry has already signed up to that statement of action. We believe that the launch and use of the international protocol, this practical manual for practitioners on the ground that I mentioned a few minutes ago, will help investigators preserve information and evidence in the aftermath of attacks, and that this in turn will improve the chances of someone being successfully prosecuted at the right time, and to protect victims and survivors from further trauma. At the summit this week, we want governments to announce their support for this protocol and to encourage their local activists, lawyers, police personnel, and doctors to use it to raise standards across the world. We recognise that there's no law that can be passed or treaty adopted that will abolish war zone sexual violence overnight. Changing the persistent culture of violence and impunity will take years, and it will be formidably difficult. This is a cause for our generation. Nevertheless, better laws and better implementation of existing laws will help strengthen prosecutions and increase the prospects for successful convictions. So we'll be urging countries to ensure their domestic laws on rape and sexual violence are in line with international standards and to make sexual violence in conflict a war crime. There should be no safe haven for perpetrators of sexual violence in armed conflict. The summit will also look at the role that the military can and does play. When sexual violence occurs in conflict zones, soldiers are often the first people on the scene, but they're not always properly equipped or trained to deal with this sensitive problem. This needs to change, and armies are often responsible for carrying out these abhorrent acts. This must stop. We want agreement to improve military doctrines and codes of conduct, and we will call for all soldiers and peacekeepers to be trained, not only to understand the gravity of sexual violence in conflict, but to prevent it and to protect people. It's important that regional and international organisations, the United Nations, NATO, the African Union, the European Union, will be represented at the summit this week to ensure that these measures are adopted at the multilateral as well as the national level. And we will ensure that these issues are on the agenda for the NATO summit, which the UK is also hosting in September. We will increase support for survivors of sexual violence and for the human rights defenders who shine a spotlight on these crimes. The British government has already committed around $200 million to this effort. And today at the summit, the British Foreign Secretary announced a further $10 million to help survivors rebuild their lives and their communities. So we will call on others to join us so many more traumatised men, women, and children can access critical support. It is in our hands to treat victims as courageous survivors, not as social outcasts. We will ask the governments of the wealthiest nations in the world to announce new funding support, including to survivors and to the local grassroots organisations which often work at the heart of the most affected communities. Our efforts build on their work, including to put women's voices right at the centre of all of these discussions. We're also working in tandem with the UK's Department for International Development, who alongside USAID have been leading a call to action to help the most vulnerable in emergency situations. Simple measures such as installing solar lighting in refugee camps and providing stoves that don't require wood to make the evening meal can dramatically reduce the number of attacks. And we want these basic protections to become universal. So not content with just holding the largest summit of its kind in London, with as much of it open to the public as possible, our instructions were to make this a truly global summit by holding events about sexual violence and conflict all around the world. And you are all part of that tonight, as this event is one aspect of our 84-hour global relay spanning every continent of the world. So let me conclude my remarks this evening by recognising the complexity and the difficulty of this issue. We don't underestimate that. But to have any hope of changing the current situation, we need multidisciplinary, multifunctional, and multinational solutions. The ultimate task is to make women and men equal partners in building peace, security, and prosperity. But at least part of the answer also lies closer to home. If all of us, whoever we are, and whatever we do, choose to do something, together we can make a difference. So let us together tear down the cloak of silence that has allowed this situation to endure. We all have a moral responsibility to speak out. And let us remember that the sexual violence that occurs in conflict situations is a continuum of the sexual violence we see in our own communities. in Britain, and here in America. So it's absolutely right that our panel this evening includes people with first-hand experience and knowledge of this international problem, as well as how these issues present themselves closer to home. Ladies and gentlemen, it is time to better support survivors. It is time to shatter the culture of impunity and ensure that justice is done. It's time to act. Thank you.
Can you guys hear me okay? Thank you, Emma, and thank you all for joining us today, braving the microburst to get here. I think we should start off by, again, applauding the British government, everybody involved in putting this event together. It's about time that somebody took the lead on such an important issue that's gone on, for time immemorial. Our conversation this evening is going to be centered around the issue of sexual violence as a weapon of war and a tactic of terror. But I think it's also important that we understand that these impulses that some people have to control another person, while exacerbated and allowed to flourish in times of conflict, aren't born there. All children are socialized, and they receive messages from adults, their peers, the media, and sexual violence is prevalent in most societies, including ours. This evening, I hope we can investigate some of the root causes of sexual violence, and I hope that this provokes a discussion into how we address the presence and minimize the prevalence of sexual violence in societies around the world. We're going to start off by speaking to two very brave women who I've gotten to meet recently, Prisca Uwigabye and Angela Williams. I'm a huge admirer of both of them, and they've agreed to share their stories with us. Then we're going to bring in the three other panelists here on the stage with me, and then finally we'll open the floor to all of you and any questions that you might have. So at this point, I'd like to bring in Prisca. Prisca is a native of Rwanda and has a degree in conflicts, reconstruction, and human security from Erasmus University. She's also a survivor of the 1994 genocide in her home country. Prisca, you're a unique voice on this topic. As a journalist, it was very interesting for me to hear her speak because she's not only a scholar, but she's also a survivor. And Prisca, I think it would be really nice if you could start off by telling us a little bit about the global problem as you see it, and then how it relates as well to your personal experience.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I would first want to thank the British Consulate for organizing this program to tell the world that enough is enough to sexual violence against women. To the audience, thank you for your presence because you'll be the force to ride on to fight all sorts of sexual violence against women. Secondly, I want to talk about sexual violence against women and how the world has so far addressed this issue before I go on and tell you my personal story. Sexual violence against women are common in conflict areas. Although none is immune to be a victim of sexual violence, women and girls suffer most from it during conflict and wars and in our homes because of our vulnerability in the society. During conflict, women do not suffer on the hands only of only rebels, but also from the military, either as peacekeepers or directly involved in conflict. Literature shows how during the Croatian and Serbian conflict, both Serbs and Croatian armies raped over 20,000 women. So if the watchman himself is stealing, how credible will his account be? It is very surprising and even more shameful to read from books and official documents that government, international humanitarian law experts, and the global civil society have all realized that rape is being used as a weapon of war and violate principles of humanity. In spite of this, no evidence exists to support the world's readiness to combat these crimes. Rape is used to make us lose our dignity and identity and our very right to live, as in the Rwandan case, where Hutu extremists used rape as a tactic to treat Tutsi women as subhuman and to tell them, quote, "You are nothing to us. We will do to you what we want," unquote. As of today, no state has ever been held unaccountable for the use of rape as a prohibited weapon of war or for their troops' involvement in rape in peacekeeping. The silence and impunity perhaps serve as incentive to rebels and state soldiers during conflicts and wars because it is very cost-effective and hence the occurrence of rape during every single conflict. It is difficult to understand the long culture of impunity. Perhaps all the strong and powerful states who should serve as police to impose this law are all guilty of similar crimes by their troops or policies, and in their fair minds feel guilty of their pasts. But for how long will we continue to nurse the guilt of our past and allow that to destroy our future? It is time for us to build a strong conscience to protect the future by putting a high price on rape and making it very expensive and ugly tool for any state or a group in armed conflict. It is my strong conviction that sexual violence against women anywhere in the world should merit the full response by international community, just as the actions of terrorists and other extremist groups do. The vague phrase, "never again," should be backed by well-defined and tangible actions to be employed to make sure that never again indeed means never again, but not a wish. After the Holocaust, the world say it will not happen again, yet the Serbian genocide came to pass. Again, never again was the catchphrase. Never again went to sleep during 1994 genocide against Tutsi, and in this period, between 250,000 to 500 girls and women, mostly Tutsis, were raped by Hutu extremists. Let me take few minutes of your time to elaborate on the effects of sexual violence on women and in the society in general. Actually, I'm one of these victims, treated inhumanly in public together with other girls because of our ethnicity and gender. Rape leaves a woman with many lifetimes problems. No level of reconciliation and reparation could address and correct them. These problems include some being infected with HIV/AIDS, unwanted pregnancies resulting in giving birth to children perceived by mothers as enemies, psychological trauma, reduction of self-esteem, fertility problems, and stigmatization. These statistics I'm going to give to you are only based on Rwandan case. More than 67% of raped women during the genocide were infected with HIV/AIDS. About 20,000 children were born to women as a result of rape. A lot of these children don't know about their pasts as their mothers refuse to talk about it. Some women do not love their children because they are a constant reminder of what they went through. A good number of these children are always ashamed to be the children of a perpetrator who raped their mothers, and those children tend to reject their identity. They are growing up with pain deep down in their hearts on the streets of Rwanda without any parental love and assistance from the government. What is going on in their minds as they grow up with little or no care, no one knows. Would they pay back to the society for punishing them for a crime they did not commit? Reconciliation and world peace become very fragile at the face of this issue because these children could easily be influenced by whoever pretends to care for them. In this sense, it should be a reminder to the world that as we leave these children to grow with their pain, we are all sitting on a potential bomb time. Now I'm going to give you, to tell you my personal story, how I was raped during the genocide. The genocide against my tribe started on the 7th of April to the 4th of July 1994. During this time, I saw death coming to me in so many ways, different ways, so many times. One of the ways I want to focus on today is when I was raped with Hutu militia. It was at dawn 11 of April when killers got us from our hide. We were taken to a nearby primary school, and we were ordered to sit down on a line, a very long line, waiting to be killed. If one person on line was killed, the other person next to her or him had to drag the body into a pit. That person will come back on the line to be killed. Whilst killings were going on there, some perpetrators, some killers started raping women in public. I always wish not to never have seen those scenes in my life. Killers and bystanders were laughing and mocking at us that we were supposed to be killed because we are cursed ones. Even God who created us had abandoned us. It was so agonizing. The torture we went through that day was so massive to bear. Some other killers will also say that, no, we want to see Tutsi women nakedness. Some women, they were removing clothes and they were coming and, yeah, we want to see how God created them. When killings were going on, one killer came to me and asked me my age, and he ordered me to follow him. He took me into a classroom together with some women and girls. We were raped and treated as rewarding items to kill us. I was kept there about 2 weeks. Whilst there waiting to be killed, there was a friend of my mom, a woman. She was a Tutsi from my tribe, but she was married to a Hutu. Her son was in the military. She sent her son to the classroom, the primary school upon hearing I was one of the girls being raped, then that military guy came to that school and told Hutu militias that he needs to take me out and he wants to kill me. Upon hearing that, I knew my time was up to die, but I was proud of it because it was better for me to die than to be in a raping camp. The guy, they released me to him, and the guy shouted on me that go, and he was having a gun. He pointed the gun on me, and each step I took, I knew I would not see the next one. That day, I was let's say, saved from the killer's hands, but sexual violence continued to happen in their house. During their house, when I was being raped, I told the mother that, complaining about pain, and the mother was quite of what was going on, and it was like, you keep quiet and take it, or we kick you out. And I didn't have where to go. So I can't continue to tell you, I can't have time to tell you all the ordeal I went through during the genocide, 100 days. But at the end of the day, I saw the light. The last line killing on the 4th, when I was waiting to be killed, I was even somehow die. I was rescued by the Tutsi rebels from the killing line. To the world, 2 decades has passed since the genocide against Tutsi happened. But to me, it is like a couple of minutes ago. Sometimes I experience flashbacks of those scenes. The public humiliation remains an immense grief to me. In aftermath, I regretted being born a woman. This brutal treatment and humiliation has left me with fertility problems, perpetual headaches, fear in my surroundings, and low self-esteem. There are times I consider myself as an insult to my family and people around me. I have been in darkness of sorrow and pain for so many years. Though nothing can make me proud of that event, seeing those who committed this odious crime eat the pie of justice will not only give me a little peace, but it will also prevent those coward men from considering women and girls as entertainment or to visit, either to satisfy their sexual passion or the tool to humiliate their enemies during conflict. We should never allow the shadow of what I and other women went through during the 1994 genocide to fall or be a legacy of our children, because they deserve better. It is therefore the collective duty of humanity to defend and promote the integrity of womanhood with messages and policies that call for true accountability of all crimes against women. What defines us, after all, is not our past, but our vision for tomorrow. Women as mother, sisters, wives, and daughters deserve better. It is time to act. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Prisca, for sharing your story. I think what we just heard underscores just how important this topic really is and the urgency that we should be acting in situations around the world that we see today, places like Syria, for example, where some of these atrocities are occurring. I want to move now to Angela Williams. She is a celebrated author and the founder of Voice Today. Her story, while it happened thousands of miles from Prisca's in a completely different circumstances, very similar. She launched a program called the Voice Movement several years ago to expose the issue of sexual exploitation in the United States. And I think that it's important for us to recognize, while today's topic is looking at sexual violence and conflict, the same things happen every day here in the U.S. and in other developed countries around the world. I think there was a study that I had read a couple days ago in preparing for this event where it said that over 240,000 Americans are sexually abused each year. That equates to roughly 1 every 2 minutes. And Angela has been a great crusader in bringing this message, a message that is quite often taboo and subject to stigma. She's been bringing it out of the darkness and into the light. So I'm hoping, Angela, you can tell us a little bit about your story and the work you've done here in the United States.
Well, I just want to say thank you, too, to the British Consulate, and thank you so much to you that are here, and I feel so very honored to be on this panel. And Prisca, you did a magnificent job. And I just want to share my story. My war zone was behind closed doors in Main Street, USA. And the weapons that were used against me were fear and terror and power and fists and belts and switches and shovels and hoes. And I had no one to defend me, and I could not defend myself because I didn't have a voice. My abuse started at age 3 after being abandoned as an infant from my father. My mother was a single mom in 1965 and was on a mission to get married and find a father for me. So she met a man and married him 2 weeks later, and my stepfather was the devil incarnate. The abuse was violent. It was something intolerable, inhumane. I was locked in hot cars, almost like a caged cat, suffocating, trying to get air. I had my head held in toilets to almost drowning. I was humiliated. The physical abuse, the emotional abuse, and then the sexual abuse started. At age 5, when I entered kindergarten, I looked around and I heard the laughter, but there was no laughter in my heart, and I felt very different. I felt like I was on the outside looking into another world. At age 8, I took a bottle of vitamins and told my 3rd grade teacher that I was going to lay my head on the desk and die that day. And my teacher called my parents, and when they came in, they said, "Oh, she's just a really dramatic child. She's looking for some attention." When I was 10, I accused a fellow classmate of raping me. And again, my parents were called in, and they said, "She really just makes up a lot of stuff. She's a liar." So not only was my stepfather grooming my mother to never believe me, he groomed everyone in my life. At age 12, I became very promiscuous. At age 15, I became very rebellious. And the more rebellious I became, the more intense the violence in our household. It was a war zone. It was a minefield. There was never a safe place. The bathroom wasn't safe. The bedroom wasn't safe. The backyard wasn't safe. The rides to the grocery store weren't safe. There was never a place that I didn't look over my shoulder to see when the next attack was coming. Some days I was raped twice a day. Some days I was raped before I went to school. This is on Main Street, USA. I don't stand alone. At age 17, I vowed I would never be raped again, and something snapped inside of me. And I stole the car, and I grabbed the bottle of vodka that was under the kitchen counter, and I went on a drive, and I took 64 sleeping pills and drank a bottle of vodka, and was determined I was going to kill myself that night. After that failed, I climbed to the top of the Talmadge Bridge. It was so cold, I was barefoot and wearing a t-shirt and blue jeans that my hands actually stuck to the metal beams. And when I got to the top of that bridge, I looked down and those black swirling waters, and I didn't have the strength or the power to jump. But I knew I was not going to go home and be raped and beaten by my stepfather again. So I told my mother what had happened, and I was given a trash bag and about 10 minutes to pack my belongings. And I was on the street. And I'm one of the lucky ones. I danced with prostitution because I couldn't get a job. And he was a nice enough guy, and he drove a nice car. And he bought me nice clothes, and he bought me something to eat. And I was sitting in a room waiting for the first John to show up. At that time, I had no idea what was happening to me. I was just supposed to be nice to his friend, really nice. And I was one of the lucky ones. I got out. And I have had a life of self-destructive behaviors. I've had a life of trying to heal. I've had a life of bad decisions, of not trusting, of boundary issues, of self-worth issues, of being received, of being loved, of being accepted, of being trying to peel off the mask to even feel like a person, feel who I was before this abuse happened, or if this abuse had never happened. I am not alone. I am the war zone. I am the conflict behind doors on Main Street, that we have got to open the doors, and we have got to look behind, and we have got to protect the innocence of our children. So Voice Today, that I founded in 2008, is really threefold. We have got to bring awareness, and I'm so grateful. This is a dream come true that we have this kind of platform globally, and we have this kind of awareness. I think we should end sexual violence, period. Period. Everywhere. We have to make people aware that every child is at risk. It's about prevention. How are we going to predict and prevent child sexual abuse? What kind of programs, what kind of education do we need in our communities to wake up? And healing. We have to have healing for survivors. There has to be aftercare in our communities to be able to deal with the emotional trauma. There is no safe place to disclose. Prisca and I both feel like we have just traumatized each of you. There is no real education for how you respond to us, for how you learn how to give us what we need, how you learn to have more compassion, more nurturing. If you have cancer, I'm going to bring you a casserole and I'm going to send you a card. If I tell you I've been sexually abused, you're like, gotta go. And you don't mean it. It's not intentional. We're just so uncomfortable with this topic and with this subject. And we don't know what to do, and we don't know what to say. So that's why it is so important. Conversations like this, a panel like this, to break the silence, we can break the cycle. So this is a first step. This is a dream come true for me. That we have a movement, that we give everybody a voice and we restore their power. so that we can stand up and we can say, not on my watch will another child be sexually abused in any way, shape, fashion, or form. Will a woman be raped? Will a man be violated? Not on my watch. And that is my dream, and that is my passion, that we stand up together and we stop being afraid of this subject. Because there are solutions, and there's some great work happening, and I'm excited to be a part of it.
I think I can speak for everybody when I just say how grateful to both of you we are for just the level of trust you have to share your stories with us. And I think that, from here on out, this should be the launching point for a discussion, not just here on the panel or in the audience, but in the broader society. I'm going to bring in 3 more voices now to share their expertise on the topic. Pamela Scully. Dr. Scully is a professor of the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and the professor of African Studies at Emory University. Brock Nicholson is the special agent in charge for Homeland Security Investigations in Atlanta. He oversees the department's investigative efforts in Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. And Karin Ryan is the senior project advisor for the Human Rights program at the Carter Center. Karin, I'd like to start with you. I think the first question most of us have, especially when talking about trying to end something like rape in a time of conflict, when you have chaos and violence at every turn, is this something that is possible to do, or is it something that we just have to live with, do you think?
Well, no. I knew you were going to call on me first. How am I supposed to speak after these 2 incredible presentations, which I just want to also thank each of you for being so willing. I think one of the things I want to say first is that it is so important to allow survivors to speak and to hear them and to be a part of the healing. For all of us to listen carefully and to be present and to be with you and to be with all of us in this, because it's painful. And we were talking before the program about how people turn away. And so I agree that this is an opportunity for us to begin, not to be comfortable with the conversation, because that will never happen, but to be welcoming of the conversation and realize that we have to have it. We have to be there for each other. No, of course, we can never accept that this is just the way it is. And I will take on that question in a few arenas, because I think in the case of conflict, I think there are things, as Emma so articulately addressed, is there are actions we can take to hold perpetrators accountable. The men who violated you, Prisca, they should be held accountable. They should go to trial. They should be held accountable in society. However, so I think there are really 2 things. One, you have to immediately take steps as the international community to pass treaties, to make agreements, to raise awareness, do everything that you're doing, which we applaud. But we also have to understand that in conflict, especially now where conflicts are so irregular, most of the conflicts in the world are irregular conflicts. They're not between large states that abide by the laws of war, for the most part. These are chaotic situations. And so with small groups, militias, warlords, et cetera, who are not going to be the ones that go to ICRC training programs. the first thing I just want to say is we have to do everything within our power to prevent conflict, period. To prevent conflicts from breaking out in the first place. And we need to be honest with ourselves that we have failed in the last 20 years in a very big way. Whether it was Bosnia, Rwanda, Congo, Iraq, etc. That if we are not about preventing conflict, which means noticing when a situation is becoming conflictual very early, years and years. Every one of these conflicts were very much erupting many years before wars broke out. So let us at least be aware in the US and the UK and other big powers that this is also our responsibility. And I would just propose that we keep that on the agenda because that helps us be more effective in our message, that we are also willing to be introspective about our own role in conflict. So I would just say that. And then on the domestic front, because the question also applies there, I would just want to mention that we had a conference about this last year here at the Carter Center. And as a result, President Carter wrote a book, just shameless plug here. President Carter wrote a book called A Call to Action. And it's called Women, Religion, Violence, and Power. And what he attempted to do was ask us to look at the root problems in this book, which are the abuse of authority, so religious authority, family authority, state authority in the case of war. So the abuse, and in particular, it's very interesting on this issue of the role of religion and how religion can be misappropriated when a woman who's suffering from domestic violence comes to church and asks for help, and he says, well, you must turn the other cheek because that's what Jesus wants you to do. This kind of power must be challenged. So we cannot accept it. Leif, to your question, there are things we can do, but I would just say, let us, while we're doing those things that we can do, all of the steps that are being recommended by this initiative, let's also remember that we have to look at root causes. You raised this at the beginning. What in our culture allows this to go on, in our religions, in our states, in our communities, and allow enough space for both things. Help the victims and the survivors, and at the same time, let's take a long-term commitment to address the root problems.
Thank you. Dr. Scully, addressing that issue, you know, I work for CNN, I don't think I mentioned that in the beginning, but just this week, we've heard stories of a woman being stoned to death outside a courthouse in Pakistan for marrying a man that she loved. 2 women were gang raped and lynched in India. We have not only the nearly 300 girls who were kidnapped by Boko Haram in northern Nigeria, but today 20 more women were taken by Boko Haram. Is this something that we're seeing more of? Is it happening more frequently? Or is this something that has always been going on and we're just now paying attention to it?
That's a really excellent question. And first of all, I'd really like to say that I do appreciate having, both the story of Rwanda in Prisca's life and also the story of America in Angela's life, and that there is a continuum. And I think it's actually very difficult to say. For example, South Africa and the Democratic Republic of Congo vie for being the rape capital of the world. And one of the debates in the South African literature is rape worse after the ending of apartheid, or does it look worse because finally you have a government that is actually looking at rape? And I think it's actually very difficult to tell. But I do think I teach. I'm an historian by training who ended up in a women's studies department, which changed my life. And increasingly, what I'm doing is teaching, trying to historicize what we're dealing with right here, which is to say So I teach a course on rape in wartime, which at the moment I've gone back to World War I. And we do World War I, the Holocaust, the rape of Berlin, Vietnam, Korea, and end up in Bosnia for that course. And I now do a series of courses. And because actually there's new attention since Bosnia and Rwanda to rape in conflict, there's now also new historical questions being asked of past conflicts. And so places where people did not expect to see rape and thought there was no story to tell, when historians go into the archives, for example, the archives of the Holocaust, they discover that there was rape. They discovered there was terrible rape. This was more widely known because of the emerging Cold War, and so there was always a story of Russians coming in to rape women in Berlin, but what was much less known was that there were American soldiers doing the same thing. And so in a way, the more we learn about rape today, thanks to the efforts of the UK government and others, the more we begin to realize that rape has been in conflict always, and so it's not a new story. However, I do think what Karin was saying, which is that there's something different, I think, about the wars of today, the last 20 years, make the synergy, this horrible synergy between domestic violence, child abuse in peacetime and rape in wartime much more entangled in ways that are truly horrible. And as Prisca said, rape in conflict is really, really cheap. You don't even need a penis. You can have a piece of wood. You don't even need to be a man to rape. And so for me, as an academic, I wrestle with, on the one hand, as we pay more attention to, and indeed have this really difficult conversation, we also make available rhetorics that people in conflict can use against people. You know what I mean? So that it's a really complicated conversation. But another thing that I would like to applaud the UK government on is they talk about ending sexual violence in conflict, not only ending sexual violence against women in conflict, because one of the features of this new questioning is, of course, that particularly I know about the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, is that men are also being raped and sexually violated. And part of, I think, the uncomfortable conversation to have is if we only talk about the protection of women and girls, we're reproducing the idea that women and girls need protection. And who do they need protection from in the normal story is men. But what do we do about men who themselves have been victims? That we need to talk about that too, because in fact that's a way of undoing an old-fashioned term, patriarchy, is if we can see men also as victims of these terrible things, not, I think, in the same numbers as women. So I think one of the worries about focusing on men's experience of sexual violence in wartime is, and I think there is a legitimate worry that suddenly you will have men's movements and all the attention will go to men. But if we think it as an analytic that we have to understand, then it becomes much less frightening, and really paying attention to men also as sexual violence victims and survivors allows us to have a conversation about the very things that people have raised, which is about gender relations. And so to end, I would say this is a really complicated question, and that it does come back to things as seemingly silly as dress codes, where high school girls have dress codes and they have to worry about whether their bra strap is showing, if they've got short skirts or whatever. The boys are allowed to do whatever because women are seen as responsible for men's sexual behavior. Mm-hmm. And that's how you end up feeling guilty and blamed for being a rape victim, as opposed to the shame attaching to the man. So it involves both historicizing the particular use of rape in particular wars, because I think it always changes, but also being brave enough to say to the Yes All Men hashtag that something seriously needs to change across the world in the way that men and women think about each other, and that we really, really have to think about every single person as a human being. Thanks.
Thank you. You know, Pamela touched on something that I thought was interesting, Brock. It is very difficult in some cases to get the information that you need from victims because of the issues of stigmatization and shame. What, as a law enforcement official, federal law enforcement official, do you and your officers in your department do to try to gain the trust of women who might have been victimized in order to tell their stories so that you can go after the perpetrators?
Thank you, Leif. But before I even answer that, I just want to say how honored I am to sit on a panel with Prisca and Angela and the bravery it takes. 28 years of law enforcement, working with incredibly brave and courageous men and women. What these women are able to do in front of you, and we see this in victims that we find all the time, it is so inspiring to me, and I thank both of you for taking to do that. It takes a whole different kind of bravery that I could never comprehend. To your question, I've had several talks with the panel members. As a law enforcement officer, and I would add one crime we've talked about in conflict, sexual violence, which we as an agency address in going after, as Emma said, allowing no shore here in the United States for those that would commit atrocities against humanity. We will hunt you, we will prosecute you, and we currently do so. Then you have the victims like Angela, child exploitation, who feel they have no voice. To that answer, we try to give them a voice. We work on projects of prevention as well as going after those the perpetrators. There's another one that hasn't been discussed tonight, and that we call the crime of human trafficking, which is a kind of combination of the two. Women are taken from abroad and brought all over the world for sexual and labor purposes, as well as women within countries that are forced into prostitution through force, fraud, coercion. And one of the most devastating things to me as a law enforcement official, and the psychological damage that these monsters do, is they convince victims that they are not victims. They are taking a human being, they have dehumanized men, women, and children to nothing more than a commodity. Human trafficking alone is second only to narcotics trafficking in the world for profitability as a crime. And the thing about a human being, unlike a commodity like narcotics, is they can abuse these women and children and men over and over. It's an unlimited source of income for these monsters. It's not an easy topic, and that's what makes it very difficult for law enforcement. Because we have victims, if they're from foreign countries, that don't feel, they have no knowledge of this country. They have a great distrust of police oftentimes. And again, the traffickers convince them they're the bad guys. I'm the only person that cares. And guess what? This was your role in life. This is what you're supposed to be. And they convince them of that topic. I have brilliant men and women that work in this investigation, and I have actually in the audience today a victim witness assistant that goes out and speaks to victims and can get them to admit that they're a victim, which for most of the crimes we investigate, rarely does a victim not want to tell you all about what happened. In this case, they do. They don't want to tell you. If it's a domestic young runaway that's been, again, tricked into, convinced through physical violence, however they ended up in prostitution. The police are the bad guys. The police are the people that arrest me. The police are the people that don't care about me. So they, again, the tool for the trafficker, the tool for the pimp, and I don't use the word pimp, I use the word child rapist, because and I don't like talking about percentages, but I can tell you that it is an extremely high percentage of any women involved in prostitution in this country started so at the age of 14 or 15, which means they had no ability to ever make that decision. We have cases where women are brought into this country, and the first night they're here, they're welcome to the USA, is they're having sex with 20, 30, 40, up to 60 men. This cannot be accepted in any society. I thank the British government for taking this on. It is a global problem, and it leads to, as we talked about at a luncheon previous to this, and then you put that in conflict, this dehumanization of human beings, and you put that in conflict and use it as a weapon, it is now, and it's like that on crack. It is like exacerbated to the point that, and the fact that we have to tell people that this is happening, and this is happening, as you heard Angela's story, you heard Prisca's story. We're currently working on, the Bosnian situation is mentioned. We are about to go to trial on a Serbian concentration guard that was procuring young girls for other guards and thought that the United States would be a good place for him to seek refuge. That will not be tolerated. And to your question, and I'll leave it at that, we think events like this, efforts like the British government's making to tell victims, you are not alone. We as a society do not accept this. You can come forward to us. A society wants to hear your voice, Angela. We want to hear that so that we can hold those responsible that are committing these atrocities and let them know that in a civilized society, we do not accept this as a behavior. Thank you.
Thanks. And Angela, I wanted to come back to a point you made in your speech. You mentioned that, if somebody is going through, a personal experience, a tragic situation, you gave the example of cancer. There is this natural gravitation towards that person to help, to provide respite, to give condolences, and just generally be there for that person. But because of the stigma that we have around sexual violence, there is this natural discomfort around the topic. And people, I had a conversation with her, and even though I've been associated with this topic for a long time, I still didn't really know how to approach getting into her personal history and her story. And she ended up kind of coaxing me, like, it's okay, we can talk about it. And for me, I think it's still something that I have a hard time broaching with somebody who's been in that situation. What should people do? Like, what advice would you have for people who maybe want to know more or want to show their sympathy? What can they do so that they don't offend you or make a terrible situation even more uncomfortable?
Well, this is a deep question, but first of all, I want to say that inadvertently, sometimes survivors are made to feel consensual in the act, and I'll give you an example. I was sexually abused for 14 years. I have disclosed in a car full of women going to a luncheon, and all of a sudden they all gasped. Immediately, that put shame on me. I have been in situations where someone has said, why didn't you tell? Why didn't you tell? Why did you do that for 14 years? So there's a huge difference in a child who is compliant because they are being tortured and violated and they're in fear and intimidated. They become very compliant in the act. And giving consent. A child can never give consent. So I think that, first of all, we have to think about our response. We have to think about our facial expressions. We have to think about if we are responding in a very compassionate way. It is one of the most difficult, and there is a veil of silence over child sexual abuse, and it is one of the most difficult things for a survivor to cut themselves open and to share one of the most violent and horrific acts of their life. It is also a level of shame that is indescribable. And in this country, 93% of the time, it is someone the survivor knows, loves, and trusts. So they may be telling you about the abuse that happened between them and their father, them and their stepfather, their brother, their uncle, their grandfather, their coach, their pastor. Somebody's very close to their family. So we as survivors are so almost protective. We're protective of our family unit. We're protective of our the family reputation. We still feel fear, maybe, and threats from that abuser. So what you need and what we need is we need a lot of compassion. When I tell you I'm a 48-year-old woman, and I'm so sorry I just told my age, but I'm a 48-year-old woman that my sexual abuse started at 3 and I was sexually abused from 3 to 17, you immediately need to see a 3-year-old in front of you. Most disclosures come from an adult, but we immediately need to think, that is a child that was violated. And so a great way that you can respond is to say, I am so sorry that happened to you. Do you know that you had no power? Do you know that you had really no way to defend yourself? And how can I help you heal? I am here for you. We often are so afraid that we're going to give you some secondhand traumatization, which probably you guys need to probably take a deep breath. Unless you're a mental health professional, a lot of people don't know how to help people process their trauma and process their pain. So just saying, I am here if you need to talk. I believe you. So often, disclosures are met with denial. Well, he's the deacon of the church. He's a good, fine man. He'd never do that. So that survivor immediately clams up and shuts up. So you need to believe them in that moment. You need to be present in that moment. You need to offer them the compassion, the nurturing, the love. And when you see them again, you don't need to ignore that they just slice themselves open in front of you. How are you doing? Can I help you find some resources to heal? Can I help you find some professional help? Maybe we can find a support group. Just walk through them with that pain like you would any other trauma in that person's life. And I hope that helps.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Prisca, I would ask from you something similar. What does it take personally? What are you able to find within yourself to be able to move on from such a traumatic experience? How are you able to push past and go on with your life?
I'm a person that who likes to pray a lot, because I quite remember that during 1994 genocide, I promised to God that if He will be able to protect me, I'll serve Him. So every time, everything I do is to praise Him, and this makes me come out and find it easy to live with other people, because at times I may sit alone, quiet, and it's not. I'm thinking about something else. I'm thinking about what happened to me, and especially when I see. Every time there is a war here, it breaks my heart. But in everything, I pray, and this is something that's helped me to come out. And yeah.
I'm going to open the floor up to questions in a moment, but I'm going to ask one final question, and I'm going to rely on the expertise of the entire panel. I'll start with you, Karin, since you're checking your phone.
No, I'm tweeting.
Okay, excellent, even better. I know listening to this, even though I'm smiling, I'm angry, right? Hearing these stories, and I've worked with Brock before, and I've heard the stories that he sees on the front lines of this issue every day. And it's absolutely appalling. All of us are sitting here in a room in Atlanta, and this is part of a much broader global conversation that's being had thanks to the British government. But what is it that we can do? What should we be doing about this? If it's not something that's coming into contact in our daily lives, how do we get involved? How do we take action?
Yes. Did you say action? Time to act? Thank you. There are many things we can do, and again, let's try to do both. meet the needs of the survivors, but also look at root causes and begin to examine. And in the book, there are 23 recommendations. On trafficking specifically, President Carter has been using his voice to promote the adoption of the Nordic model for countering trafficking.
What is that?
The Nordic model is the robust prosecution of pimps and customers of trafficking victims and prostitutes, so both domestic prostitution and trafficking. Some people like to say there's a very rigid line between regular prostitution and trafficking. It's not true. So the Nordic model is very important. Canada is considering this. We just got an appeal from Ireland to help with that campaign. So I think if one thing we can do, and I hope that the summit and the British government can help promote this idea of really promoting the Nordic model. The Carter Center, along with Rotary, and Dave McCleary is here from Rotary, may be convening a conference here at the Carter Center on this, so I'd invite people to be involved in that. On the root cause issue, I think what we are hoping to do, I'll just tell you what the Carter Center is hoping to do. We've been convening people of faith and religious leaders, and Angela and I were talking earlier about some of her work in this area. It's really, really important to get this message into the churches and the mosques and the synagogues, because the authority that the pastor, the priest, or the imam, or the rabbi have in the community is really can't compare to the authority of the state, right? So we are working with religious leaders in Africa, in the Middle East, hopefully here in the US as well, to bring that message, to make it safe in our places of worship to have this conversation. But the second sort of taking a step back and looking at the broader causes is we really have to begin examining our culture of violence. Really. I mean, this is the longer term strategy. We've got to, with our families and our children and our communities, begin questioning the culture of violence that we have apparently accepted. Another school shooting today. There'll be another one tomorrow probably. Guns, violence in our music, video games, etc. I know that seems like way too big a question to really take on and chew on it and do anything about it, but it's not true. We have to think about how this is true in our lives. Our foreign policy, our government must respond if we are not happy with a overly militaristic foreign policy. If our college campuses are not safe for girls to not be raped, 1 in 5, then that's in our control to do something about. We know that in the case of college rape, it's a small number of perpetrators. It's not that all the boys on college campuses are running around raping girls. It's a small number of perpetrators, but they're not prosecuted. That we can do something about. So anyway, there's 23 recommendations in the book. The Carter Center will continue to be working on this. So thank you for allowing us the space to offer some ideas.
Excellent. Pamela, is there anything you'd like to add?
Just briefly, in all my classes, I teach at Emory, but I've taught at other liberal arts colleges in America. And in all my classes, I have my students read international news, and not from United States papers. So they use the BBC News, they can read Al Jazeera, I don't really care, the Times of India, but we spend 5 to 10 minutes or more every day that we meet discussing the news, because one of the things I think we all have to take on much more seriously in America is how incredibly ignorant we allow ourselves to be. So that when something is happening in Rwanda, I teach about Rwanda and the genocide, and one of the things that's striking is how people at the very highest level of government could hardly find Rwanda on a map, and it felt so far over there, and they completely misread what was going on because they'd never done, I have a whole riff, but they'd never done African history in a country where we have so many people descended from Africa. both historically descended from Africa and many people from Africa today who've moved here, to not teach the history of Africa, Rwanda, know the difference between Africa as a continent, it's not a country. I mean, there's so much that goes into understanding the world that would have allowed a decent analytic interpretation of what was going on in Rwanda, which couldn't just be described as something happening over there, but was really a complex political strategy of genocide. I think something might have been done, but each of us have to take responsibility for being really ignorant. I'm sorry. I've given trustees, at one institution, not Emory, I gave the trustees a map of Africa and said, could you please, they asked me to come and talk about what I do, gave them a blank map of Africa and said, please, can you name the countries on the map? They got Egypt and South Africa. These are trustees. I mean, these are seriously leaders. So we need to look inside ourselves and really own up to how incredibly ignorant we allow ourselves to be and the consequences of that ignorance to taking things seriously, including sexual violence and conflict.
Yes. Well, I live my life 24 hours a day pretty much trying to contemplate this. And I think one answer that Voice Today offers is prevention. We've really got to teach adults how we predict and prevent child sexual abuse. Because if we look at the CDC ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, and the health consequences of childhood trauma, you look at drug and alcohol addiction, you get depression, you look at eating disorders, you look at the prostitution issue, the human trafficking issue, and 80 to 90% is rooted in child sexual abuse. So how are we going to protect our children when they come out of the womb? So being able to provide curriculum in our communities, I know many of you here probably have children, and many of you probably never had a class on how to predict and prevent child sexual abuse. But it's a real problem, it's a real risk, so why don't we face it with education that's going to breed action so we can become very vigilant about protecting our children at a very young age. We know the median age of sexual abuse is 9. We need to be empowering our children. So we have a whole menu of curriculum, of programs to educate on Tough Talk to Tender Hearts, the grooming mystery, single parenting solutions, internet safety. The list goes on and on. But we need to also teach our children, and we have a program called Find Your Voice, about personal boundaries and personal power. We have to empower our children with a voice and with permission, and we have to give them the permission to disclose. We have to be educating them that your private parts are only touched in health and hygiene. What is appropriate, what's not appropriate. They have to be taught that from the time they're able to communicate. And we have a really exciting program that is in its infancy stage, and it's called Physicians' Power to Protect. Why don't we have prevention initiatives in our pediatricians' offices during a well check? That's a 15-minute conversation with the caregiver and the child. Why don't we have prevention initiatives in our communities? And then aftercare. We have got to help survivors heal so that we can raise up a generation of healthy people. If women can't protect themselves, they can't protect their children. So we have got to get aftercare in our communities. We have AA is doing a great job. Alcoholics Anonymous, we need survivor groups on every corner. We need workshops, retreats, areas outside of the mental health appointment, which is a necessary part. Certainly mental health professionals and counseling is an important part, but for the community to welcome and offer healing programs is an important component. So those are some of my solutions. I have a lot more if any of you would like to meet with me.
Excellent. And Brock, one of the things that Angela just touched on was this issue of grooming. How do we protect our children from becoming a victim of a situation like human trafficking and being the target of a potential trafficker?
Thanks, Leif. I don't know how you couldn't hear everything and know that it's a time to act, but to do the prevention thing is such a tough thing. Like Angela said, you have to get the message out. We have to let people know, give children the ability to defend themselves. One of the analogies I like to use is the internet. If any of you have ever traveled to the Grand Canyon and have been in the Grand Canyon, you know there's no fences there. And I would venture to say any responsible parent would never let their child climb on the edge of the Grand Canyon and fall a mile to their death. Yet the same parents will let their child peruse the internet unguarded, unlooked at. The internet is the Grand Canyon. There are predators out there as I've talked to Leif about, that I see every day from the work my folks do, at epidemic numbers. And yet, to feel that our children trust us, we allow them to play on the Grand Canyon. I would say that that's one way. You know, and it's forms like this, and I just want to publicly thank. And this is a crime. These crimes are one that, doing this for many, many years, this is a crime that we as law enforcement cannot do alone, without groups that work with survivors, without groups that work with children, without groups that spread this message, whether it to be to hospitals, to teachers, to schools. And I will tell you, I would like to personally praise the state of Georgia and what they do. Georgia, about 5 years ago, said, when Atlanta was known as one of the human trafficking hubs in the United States, when we were known for child prostitution, we were known for a lot of things you don't want to be known for. The governor of Georgia said enough. He commissioned the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, who we partner with and work on these issues every day, and said, we need to stop this. Child Service, Ms. Bunn is sitting in the front row. There are folks that are working in this state each and every day, and it's a model of how people should say, we don't accept this. The business community said, we don't accept this. The educational community, the university said, we don't accept this. The forums like this, the Carter Center, saying, we don't accept this. And that's what, as a society, we have to do. And thank you again to the British government saying, we can't accept this. But it takes people seeing something and saying something. Don't just, because it is an uncomfortable topic. The media doesn't want to talk about it. The grooming issue. For a long period of time, Amazon sold a book authored by a gentleman who told people how to groom children for sexual activity, how to groom their parents to allow them access, this sold on Amazon for years till we finally fought it. And they used the First Amendment again, you can't take. We as a society can't accept that. So that's what we can do. We can just, as the slogan says, a time to act and say no more in this society. And everyone is a part of this. It's protecting your children. It's watching out for others' children. It's for acting when it's time to act. It's easy to just turn your eye and say, most people have that with this crime. It's something that happens to someone else. If you talk about trafficking of folks, that's something that happens in third world nations. If you talk about this very topic about in conflict, like Angela said, there's conflict behind doors here in the United States. It's this distancing oneself from this can't happen to me. I can't tell you how many parents that my folks and that we deal with that thought this couldn't happen to me. It can and it does every single day.
Yeah, sure.
I just want to add, too, that you can contact your elected officials. We need a movement across this country to remove the statute of limitations on the criminal and civil courts because disclosures come later in life. It's very difficult, the burden of proof for a child. Often to get prosecution, they need physical evidence, and it heals very quickly, and you're talking a very small child against an adult. And sometimes the disclosures don't come until into adulthood, so that perpetrator is continuing to sexually abuse children. So we really need to contact our elected officials and let them know that we are behind getting justice for survivors and remove those statute of limitations. And Georgia has done a great job on the criminal side, but we have got a lot of work to do on the civil side. So.
Great. So the floor is open to anybody with questions. There's microphones on either side. If you just want to go up to the microphones. We'll start with you.
Yeah, two things. I'd been fortunate to write a book, Doc Hollywood, we made into a movie a while back. And I'd love to see a movie and a book. We worked on a book we put out, Puberty Prevention Club, where kids who never learned what puberty's about don't understand why their friends are going out on dates. And that happens because it's not even discussed. But doing it in a G-rated, entertaining way where kids can just learn that there's something that goes on in your body. And as you say, doing that through the school system, I think that's one issue. The other issue I will say that I will die feeling guilty about is I'm Jewish, and Hitler was somebody I didn't particularly like a lot. In the Congo right now, we have Hitler live, but it's not him, it's a massive killing of millions of girls that the world has ignored generally. At the Carter Center, there was a guy who wrote a book on this, who spoke a couple of years ago, and he said they are mining the minerals. They're mining minerals for cell phones and computer chips, making tons of money off of them. And these companies have military to protect the minerals. And at the end of the day, they said, you all did a great job. Now go out, rape the girls. That's what they tell them. They protect the minerals, but rape the girls and have fun. And the number of girls who have died, we had a girl working at Emory in the cafeteria, a woman who calls on her cell phone. She can call and talk to a niece who was raped and the father shot in the head and killed. The way I think that issue can be addressed, and we tried to do it, was go on the streets with posters saying, just like Wall Street, that we as humans on Earth cannot have this happen. And this will give the politicians the power to really do something about it. If every day, and we went out, and it was on the front page with signs like this, for the times we went out. But if we had thousands of people in the world going out and doing this every day for half an hour once a week, I think you might get a lot more impact than just, conferences like this are great, but you've got to have
the grassroots, social media push as well.
Right.
And I think the End Sexual Violence Conference and the 84-hour conversation that's sparked, hopefully that's just the beginning. That's not the end, and we can say, well, we know a lot of information now about this. Hopefully it's, what I would like to see out of this event is all of us go out to our own sphere of influence, to our family and our friends, and bring this message, bring Angela and Prisca's stories to the people in our lives, so that they can become sensitized. We can, it's a ripple effect, I think, where you have to expand the circle of people who are cognizant of the problem, and also who are angry enough to take action, like you did with the situation. Was that the Coney 2012? Was that what you were referencing, or was that another?
Nope. Yeah. This was just, there were specific events, but my wife and I and students would go out once a week on the streets in front of Emory, and we did it in front of CNN with Spelman students. But we do it every week. And we were hoping that other people, that it would become infectious and other people would do it too. Yeah. But it didn't end up being a Wall Street.
Prisca, I think you wanted to respond to that.
Would everybody here go out next week on the street? I'll give you $1 if you do it.
Prisca, you wanted to say something?
Thank you. I would like to ask everyone here in this room to be a voice of the victims, in a way that we everyone is going to go out and, let's say, ask the international community to physically fight those perpetrators, because it's always, I always surprised on this issue, because the international community is always there to watch. I'm not blaming them, I'm sorry, but it seems they always want to watch. They are like bystanders. They always sit and say, let's see if whether we are going to intervene or not. During that period of taking decision, victims are being raped, victims are being killed. So it is, I think, me and anyone who wants to join this fight, we should ask the international community to have a standby troop well equipped to go to fight those perpetrators. They should not, just be there to say, like in the case of Rwanda, when people were being killed, we had the UN troops on the ground. They didn't protect anyone. So it is time for us to ask them to physically fight those perpetrators. Thank you.
Your question?
Hi, I'm a graduate student at Rollins School of Public Health at Emory University. And first I want to thank you guys for being here. I think interdisciplinary action is the only way to make things change. But I think there's a part of the solution puzzle we haven't talked about, and that's the prevention of perpetration. And I was just wondering if anyone on the panel could talk about how do we prevent individuals and from communities from becoming perpetrators? How do we target at-risk groups and that aspect? Because I believe without that part of the puzzle, this problem can't really be solved.
Would you like to discuss that, Karin?
Yeah, thank you. The way to help perpetrators not to be involved in killings or raping women is, first of all, educate them about the consequences of, let's say, rape. If we could tell them, the way I see rape as one of biological weapon, if we can tell them how it can destroy the whole society and tell them the consequences they're gonna face. If really there are serious punishment in front of them, you educate them and you show them consequences in front of them, even if it's gonna be 100 years that they're gonna face it, I think it will help to prevent those perpetrators to be involved in killings or raping women. Thank you.
Brock.
One of the things that we see, and one of the things when you talk about perpetrators, it's doing as much as saying, stop using a word like pimp, that in this country, unfortunately, I know if you go out at Halloween, you'll see kids, adults in pimp costume. If we turn the term to child rapist, I would venture to say nobody's going to send their kid out as a child rapist. I'd like to think in a civilized society we wouldn't. But it's taking that and not just, I was telling these guys, I was talking to an AP reporter who said, well, prostitution's the oldest, form of business in the world. To just accept that premise that because something has been around for a long time, it makes it right in a civilized society is a mistake. And to educate people, that's what they are, and we have actually gone after the perpetrators, if you will, the clients of young women, saying that this is not acceptable. You wouldn't accept, if it was your mother, if it was your daughter, if it was your sister, would you do this? And that these girls, and educating that whether it be prostitution, educating in conflict area, that this is, that again, that in a civilized society, that is not what we do. We have to expect better of young men and women, and unfortunately, in trafficking, we see women involved as the perpetrators. It's a scary thing to me that it used to be an unfortunate thing of my gender was 99% of the perpetrators. We are starting to see a vast number of women involved in this crime as well. And that's scary. And we have to tell people, again, it's not acceptable.
Karen, you wanted to add something?
Just a couple of things. I mean, I want to highlight both the role of leadership at a high level and at a more local and personal level. Look at the impact of somebody like the Pope, for example, who could articulate something to an entire community of 1 billion people, and sort of the ripple effect and how that might change perceptions if the Pope, somebody with that kind of platform, would become a spokesperson. And we see this Pope trying to articulate different messages from before. This kind of position of leadership can, I think, really amplify some of the solutions that we're talking about. I think also at a smaller level, just a couple of stories. One is a reverend in Kenya who goes into the prisons in Kenya, and he teaches about what he calls fraudulent masculinity, which is a very interesting phrase that he uses. And he tells men that they have been, basically miseducated about something called fraudulent masculinity, and it's a disease. And he's preparing them to go back out into the world and to treat women as equals. This is something also here in Atlanta. One of our partners named Pastor Paul Palmer, who works here in Atlanta on trafficking and on prostitution, working with survivors. At our conference last year, he said, as a pastor, I have failed to teach the boys and girls in my congregation about their equal dignity. I need to, as a pastor and as a parent, we all need to do this. We need to change our language. We need to not use the word pimp, but we need to confront every little expression of male domination that we find, and it's everywhere. This is up to all of us, So I think at the high level, we should expect our leaders and our political leaders, it's very important, like the US government, the governments, but our religious leaders as well. Imagine if all of the religious leaders began to insist that street harassment in Egypt stop tomorrow. This would have a big impact. So I think we should expect our leaders, both at the high level and in our small communities, to change our language, talk about things like patriarchy, talk about things like fraudulent masculinity, confront that form of harassment on the internet when it happens. Be leaders. We all can be leaders. And that will prevent, because then young boys and young girls will say, well, maybe I don't want to participate in that.
Yes.
This question, hi. First of all, thank you all for your stories and the information today. My name is Arnett Mumford. I'm on the board for a nonprofit that deals with labor and trial trafficking domestically as well as internationally. My question is for Mr. Nicholson. What's currently being done by the U.S. government and local governments to make it so that people who are here trafficked either through legitimate means or people who've been brought here and either their documentation is taken away or they've been told that they can't go to the police or to an agent because they see on TV every day about Mexicans and Africans and people that, quote unquote, aren't American being persecuted, thrown into ICE holdups and everything else. Is there anything that's done to make that transition easier? And is there any type of path to citizenship or anything that can say, okay, I came and I turned in the person that's been oppressing me, but what's to prevent me from being immediately sent back to the country where I was taken from?
I'm glad you asked that question. Yes, there is. As we like to say to people, we are the Department of Homeland Security, not for just those that were born here. We are the Department of Homeland Security for anyone on our shores. So certainly we have something called the T visa for victims of trafficking. We have something called a U visa for those that have been victims of other crimes of violence. here in the United States, and it is a path to it can be a path to citizenship where those individuals choose it. Oftentimes in the labor and domestic, oftentimes they just want to return home, and that's okay too, because again, we are victim-centric. That's the most important thing. Obviously, we want to get rid of those folks that are doing this, and to do that, oftentimes the cooperation of the victim is imperative in going to trial. And certainly, we as a government have established methodologies for those people. They have no fear of deportation. They have no fear. This government does not do that, and I'm glad you asked that question.
Great. We're going to have time for just a couple more questions.
Okay. So first, I'd like to start off by thanking the panel. I think this entire event is wonderful. One topic I feel like we haven't necessarily talked about tonight with sexual violence is sexual violence in the military. I feel like it's become a rising issue that people have become more aware of how common it is, especially to the men and women in the United States military. So my question to the panel is, what do you think can be done to prevent sexual violence in the military, and how do we address this?
Thank you. Well, first, that's a great question. First of all, I would say in President Carter's book, he has specific discussion of how institutions validate sexual violence, and he calls out universities and the military for this. So I think the more awareness we have of this situation, the better, but it does take the kind of leadership that Karin was talking about. It doesn't help if someone, in Afghanistan talks about sexual violence and then, gets told they have to be quiet, or the general who takes it, is taken right up to the level of general, who then says, well, it wasn't that bad and please be quiet. I mean, you have to have leaders in the military who are willing to prosecute these charges and take it seriously. I do think we are seeing more consciousness around this. We're having hearings in the Senate. They didn't go as well as one expected, but I do think this is raising the bar. And frankly, I'm not joking either, something like the House of Cards TV series, which had this as a central, narrative issue of their last season, it's really important. People get used to the idea that maybe this is something we can talk about. And at universities, which are also institutions which have been bad on this issue, we now have task forces, including at Emory on Title IX, trying to make sure that we respond appropriately to sexual violence issues. And as Karin was saying, with Dr. David Lissack, who's done study of offenders, he started at a university and has now moved on to helping the Navy, and kudos to the Navy for taking this seriously, is the studies they've done do show indeed that a very few number of men are responsible for most crimes, for most sexual violence in universities and in the military. And so one of the points that he makes, which Angela was saying also, is when a woman comes forward and says, I was raped, the first thing that someone in a university or a military situation needs to understand is that that woman is telling the truth. And she needs to be taken seriously because probably the man who raped her has raped other women too. And so if you take it as this is not date rape or something else, or something could be called date rape to be washed under the carpet. The men who do this are predators, and they know exactly what they're doing. And I really recommend a video. It's an enactment of an interview that David Lissack did with a man he calls Frank, who was a perpetrator on a college campus. And it's an actor acting out, the actual script of this interview. And it is absolutely chilling for anybody who is at a university, because this man knows exactly what he's doing. It goes from giving the girl drinks at the party, and then how you move them upstairs, and it ends with him putting his hand across her neck. And the interviewers, and the key thing that David Lissack says is you mustn't use the word rape. If you use the word rape, the perpetrator won't talk. If you talk about sexual encounters but it's an absolutely predatory thing. So I think having leadership that takes this issue seriously, believing the victims when they say I was raped, enough to start doing investigations, is all important. But again, it takes, as Karin was saying, all these different levels. And that's why an event like this, I think, is so important, because it raises consciousness about sexual violence and conflict, but it makes us also think about how our society perpetuates this kind of thing every single day.
Leif, can I just add one small point?
Sure.
There is a bill being reintroduced to take the cases of sexual violence in the military out of the chain of command, and this is something that President Carter, as a former naval officer himself, has supported, and he's going to work with Senator Gillibrand to pass that bill. So you can all do something about that. Contact your senator in Georgia, because I think our senators actually might matter on this question, is to support this version of the sexual violence bill.
We have time for one final question.
God, thank you. Mine is not a question, it's a sort of encouragement and a way of trying to maybe contribute. And it is about prevention of this sexual violence in the society. When we come to develop society like that of US, where the institutions are there, the political will and commitment is there. So why then do we still have sexual violence in the society? It is because there is an information gap. Information is not flowing to the institutions that are ready to act to prevent this. And why is it that? It is that because there is this hegemonic masculinity in play, where women themselves, like Angela said, have accepted the fact that they will not go out to tell their story if they should be abused sexually by someone. Why? Because it is believed that when they go out, you are trying to expose yourself. You are trying to go and show your nakedness to the public. After all, no one was born with pants on. And so it doesn't sound well to tell me that when you go out to tell your story, it's like you are exposing yourself to the public. I think the sort of education, the method of education that you're using, you should also revise that method. Let's assume that this mic I'm using now is not for me. If I should pick it from here and they run away with it, it's for Carter Center. And the Carter Center come to arrest me and go to the world to tell the world that Thomas has stolen our mic. The concept here in hegemonic masculinity is Carter Center is ashamed and Thomas goes head up. So why should someone who is raped, when he comes out to tell his story, why should he be ashamed and then the rapist with his head up? That is insane. It doesn't make sense. And so we should tell our women and whoever will be sexually abused that they are the property owners. And so they have the rights to come out at any time to make the information available for the institutions to act.
Excellent. Beautiful sentiment.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have been given the near impossible task of providing some concluding remarks to tonight. But before I endeavour to try and do that, please join me in giving a big round of applause and thank you to our wonderful panel. Now, I thought tonight was a truly wonderful event, and big thank you to Kate Greer and Alec Brodsky from the Consulate General in organising this, and also to the Carter Centre for being our partner in this wonderful event. Now, in trying to provide some concluding remarks, what I'm going to do is just highlight the various things from tonight that really struck me personally. And of course, this is a very subjective attempt to try and sum up, because we all have different things that we will have taken away from tonight. First of all, I was very struck by my colleague Emma and the way she highlighted the progress that's been made over the last 18 months on the political track with things like the G7 debates and the UN Security Council debate. But also I was very struck by the way she highlighted the need to do the practical work, the stuff to get things done, such as the summit, the protocols, and holding those responsible to account, all of which is very important. Second, I'm sure like everybody else, I was absolutely struck by the wonderful testimonials that we heard from Angela and Prisca tonight. There's nothing like that sort of personal testimony to really bring home the importance of this subject and the importance to all work together to try and end sexual violence. And from Prisca, I found that a couple of things that really struck me again. First of all, the fact that she said that silence and impunity serves as an incentive to the rapists and those who conduct violence. Also, the fact that we need to put a high price on rape, and that never again really does mean never again. From Angela, I was struck again by the fact that she referred to the domestic violence as a war zone, the domestic sexual violence, one that goes on behind the windows and doors of mainstream USA, but also obviously Main Street UK, Main Street every country in the world. And also the need for us all to stand up together and to stop being afraid of the subject. And then from the panelists, the various words of wisdom that really struck me again were the fact that we need to do everything possible within our powers to end the conflict in the first place. And that's ending conflict is one of the prime roles of diplomats like myself and Emma and others. So it's very important to have that underlined again and again. Also the need to look at the root causes, and also the fact that a lot of sexual violence is actually stems from the abuse of authority, be it political authority, parental authority, uncle's authority, or the authority of religious figures or military figures. Then there's also the fact that we need to remember to talk about men as victims of sexual violence as well, that this is not just women, that there are many men who also suffer from sexual violence, both domestically and in conflict and in other ways. And also, of course, the importance that we all see each other as individuals and as human beings, not as men and women, not as different people from different nations, races, or whatever. And then also, of course, the need to remember human trafficking and the fact that it dehumanizes its victims by convincing them that they're not victims at all, one of the worst things you can do to anyone. And then on a more positive note, we heard from everybody about what certain things we could possibly do. That we could, for example, when tackling prostitution and trafficking, we could look to adopt the Nordic model on those issues, which will penalise those people who use prostitutes and those people who are pimps for prostitutes. Not that we want to use that word in any potentially nice way. Also the fact that we need to question cultures of violence within our own societies, be those societies here in the United States, in Europe, or in countries at risk of conflict, countries in conflict, or countries in post-conflict situations. And also the fact that the society and the international community as a whole needs to say that we won't accept this violence that goes on behind closed doors, or this violence that goes on in conflict or in post-conflict, etc. Finally, I'd just like to say that this conference that we have here, the conference that's going on in London, this is not the end of this at all. This is only the beginning of this endeavour to tackle sexual violence. Just to note that in Britain we will be having another summit later in the summer, hosted by the Prime Minister, which will focus on women and girls. And in the September NATO summit, PSVI will be very much a major topic of discussion in Wales. So let me just finish by saying, of course, it's now a time to act. Let's all go together and act on this.